You could make the mistake of thinking that the phone hacking scandal is about phone hacking. It isn't, that's just the beginning of the thing. This was always, obviously, a story about power. You have this former Australian with an American passport who owns 4 national newspapers and a national news channel. And he has access to politicians of a kind ordinary people can't dream of, and he has power to influence what that government decides to do. These are selfish, ruthless people. I don't think they worry too much. But it's kind of scary, bearing in mind the myths we tell about ourselves, that we live in this democratic society. The power of a bully in a school playground, and once this bully has beaten up 2 or 3 kids and made pulp out of them, the other kids get the message and they set out to placate the bully. It's about fear. Do you listen to Bob Dylan? You know, he had ages ago, mid-60s, he had this song about even the President of the United States sometimes must have to stand naked. But I use that at the end of the story. Even the President of News Corp sometimes may have to stand naked.
That is the first I've heard of that.
What do you make of Julian in the last 3 years, watching him at the embassy in London and his health degrade and watching Wikileaks?
He's a very clever guy, but I think it's such a damn shame. Sometimes he just does crazy, stupid things. He shouldn't have gone off to these other news organizations. That was stupid. And he could have made much better decisions about these Swedish women. I wish he'd just come out and gone back to Sweden and faced it. And he should treat people better.
While preachers preach of evil fates, teachers teach that knowledge waits can lead to $100 plates. Goodness hides behind its gates, but even the President of the United States sometimes must have to stand naked.
Nick Davies is the man who took the Rupert Murdoch media empire to court over the phone hacking scandal. He also brokered the deal between Wikileaks and The Guardian. He is the old school journalist to the max, and he schooled me on all of the tiny items that added up to ultimately Rupert Murdoch himself being called forth in front of a tribunal here in London. And it was fascinating. Fascinating to find out that his story is not unlike the movie All the President's Men, which spoke about Woodward and Bernstein uncovering what was happening with the Watergate scandal, and how all of these tiny, seemingly insignificant details brought down heads of police, closed an entire newspaper here in London. And it was fascinating to hear what changed and what still hasn't changed when it comes to the power of the media and that passive power that he talks about that Rupert Murdoch has over politicians in this country, over the police in this country, and it's enough to make you want to sit up and really be aware about what's going on. And if that wasn't enough, he goes on to tell us about his fascinating relationship with Julian Assange and tells me the stories about meeting Julian in Brussels, about having to keep everything quiet, and about how Julian even pre-leaked a lot of the information and almost ruined the entire deal. So it was just fascinating sitting down with Nick. I feel really honored that I got to really dig down and find out, what this was all about, and also find out his perspective on where journalism is heading in the future, and why he is not very impressed when it comes to the internet media and media that isn't backed by true journalistic integrity. So it was great to get his point of view, and very special that our long form type of interview can really capture all of the information, because it's not simple and yet it has such a huge impact on how we live our lives. A lot of people have been asking me, I get stopped in the street and they're like, Brian, what is this academy all about? Well, I'll let you in on a secret. The London Reel Academy is a group of 1,000 of the hardest core London reelers from around the world, and we get together and we push ourselves. We upgrade our peer groups and we accomplish our goals, and we do it kind of as a tribe. And we have online coursework, we have meetups, we share premium content from our interviews, And we also get together in person. And we do it in cities around the world, including London, where people come to the studio every month. And we sit down for 3 hours and I find out what their story is and how we can get them to push themselves to get things done in their lives. And it's fascinating. It's something I'm so proud of. And it's probably the best thing that ever happened from this entire mindset that is London Real. And I put together a quick video about it. Check it out.
The entrepreneurial journey, it can be a lonely road. I push myself in so many areas, but you know, you can't do it all yourself.
The thing about the Academy is, it's like, look, you have the ideas, you have the ability, you have the skill, and you have the sort of ambition for yourself. But when you have a group of people pulling you forward, it's so important.
Accountability is what's missing from most of the programs or any gurus or any internet mentor that I had before.
I wanted to get some accountability. I wanted to make myself accountable to a group, to you.
The reason we started the Academy is because I felt like we were doing these amazing talks, like we'd have a Peter Sage episode or a Dan Pena episode or a Kala or someone, and you get super inspired and then YouTube stops and then you go back to your life and you don't make any changes. And it was just like, it felt like, what are we doing? If you're designing your life right, the good times are now. And in a few years, you'll look back and say, wow, that was amazing.
The thing about the Academy is it has so many different sort of layers to it. I think your web seminars are awesome. The way you broke it down and the style of your teaching is pretty awesome.
I like the feed. When I have to motivate myself, I kind of look at others struggling and getting over those struggles. So I actually follow daily the feed.
Best feature would be the sort of Facebook aspect of it, the social media aspect of it, as in creating a profile with your goals, your dreams.
Everyone's on the same vibe, and we may be at different stages in our journeys, but everyone's on the same page at the end of the day. Everyone's really trying to push themselves and building the best you. It really resonates with me.
And the fact that I'm committing a small amount of money and the fact that I'm actually trying to interact with those people means that I'm invested and means that I will keep it for the long run.
You have to be serious about yourself and what you want to achieve. And if you're serious about yourself, this is going to be such a fantastic platform.
London Real, sponsored by Bulletproof.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Nick Davies, the man who took the Rupert Murdoch empire to court over the British phone hacking scandal and brokered the relationship between the Guardian newspaper and Wikileaks. You have written extensively as a freelancer, as well as for the Guardian and the Observer, and have been named Reporter of the Year, Journalist of the Year, and Feature Writer of the Year at the British Press Awards. Your book, Hack Attack: How the Truth Caught Up with Rupert Murdoch, became a Sunday Times bestseller and was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize in 2015. Nick, welcome to London Real.
Hi.
Thank you for being here.
Okay.
I guess it's been 8, almost 9 years now since the hacking scandal broke in 2007. You know, we have people all around the world that tune in here, and I was wondering if after that much time has passed, if you have a different perspective on it that you did even a year ago or 2 years ago, I know as the public, we were fed little bits of it piecemeal. And it's something I kind of want to explore with you today, because we heard things in 07 and then in 11, and then we saw a tribunal and kind of the pieces. But is there any way that you look at it differently now than when you were in it?
Actually, I don't think I do look at it differently, but because the big picture was always clear from the outset. So you could make the mistake of thinking that the phone hacking scandal is about phone hacking. It isn't. That's just the beginning of the thing. This was always, obviously, a story about power. And the immediate reason for that is that you had this newspaper, the News of the World, where they were routinely breaking the law to get hold of information for their stories, very frequently by hacking into people's voicemail messages. But the crucial thing was that by the time I started working on it, it was clear that the police at Scotland Yard, the Metropolitan Police, were sitting on very detailed, voluminous evidence of that crime occurring and had decided not to investigate it. So why would the most powerful police force in the United Kingdom make a decision like that? And then you see that the press regulator, which was never very powerful, was sitting on the sidelines, and they too were refusing to investigate it. And in fact, when we started working, they put out a report that said, The Guardian, my newspaper, a lot of old crap, and defended the News of the World. What's going on here? This is about power. This is about the fear of getting into a fight with the most powerful news organization in the country. And the final part of this is when you move beyond it, you see the same pattern in government. So you may have heard of this rather quaint old idea that we adopted here for a while. They call it democracy. It's a kind of odd thing. The idea was that each of us would vote and we'd elect a government that would, roughly speaking, do what we wanted. But forget that. You have this former Australian with an American passport who owns 4 national newspapers and a national news channel. And he has access to politicians of a kind ordinary people can't dream of. And he has power to influence what that government decides to do, far more than the electorate. So what I'm saying is that the hacking of voicemail messages is just the way in to a story about power. From the outset, it was obviously about power. And I don't think in that sense the big picture perspective on the story's changed.
It almost feels like the movie All the President's Men, where they follow the money. It's like each one of these steps, as I've heard you talk about it, almost leads to something else and then leads to something else. And it kind of further unfolds to where almost then there's a public sentiment that allows it to kind of move forward. Yeah. And then you talked about this kind of soft power that the media has over the politicians, where it's not even a overt threat. It's this kind of this institutionalized fear. Yeah, passive power.
So that's it. The idea with passive power is it's a bit like the power of a bully in a school playground. And once this bully has beaten up 2 or 3 kids and made pulp out of them, the other kids get the message and they set out to placate the bully. It's about fear. So in the case of somebody like Rupert Murdoch, you can see 2 kinds of fear operating. This is really thinking in the kind of political context, which is the one that matters. So first of all, there is an individual fear that his newspapers might come and expose this imaginary politician's personal life, sex life.
Which there's a history of that in
Exactly.
Britain.
So this is the point, that every MP, every captain of industry, every trade union leader has seen it happen to somebody in their circle, that they've had this enormously painful and humiliating experience of their sex life being exposed all over the front page of Murdoch's newspapers. And they don't want that to happen to them. So Murdoch doesn't have to threaten that he's going to do that. They start off, almost all of them, from a position of fear. And then you can add to that individual fear a kind of organizational fear that again, they've seen it happen to other people, that if these newspapers target your union, your corporation, your political party, they can destabilize that organization to the point where it ceases to be able to function, because every day is a crisis, because some damn new thing has appeared on the front page of a newspaper. It may be true, it may be false, but the share price is falling, the staff are rebelling, there are people withdrawing their support. It's chaos. So you put those 2 fears together, and that begins to explain the extraordinary power of a media mogul in our society, and why he doesn't have to run around telling people what to do. They will take the initiative to try to placate him, to try to calm him down so they don't get into trouble. And it's kind of scary, bearing in mind the myths we tell about ourselves, that we live in this democratic society.
And strangely enough, it's because the royal family was involved in 07 that this even surfaced, because anyone else, if that had been initially hacked, it probably never would have been looked into or investigated further.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right, because there were examples over the years of public figures who realized that the News of the World must be getting inside their voicemail messages, and that went nowhere. But what happened was that Prince William and his staff realized that two particular stories that appeared in the gossip column in the News of the World could only have come from voicemail messages. And so they called in the police. And as you suggest, I mean, the joke is that really Murdoch's prestige in this country at that time was very, very high. And very few people had more prestige, and the royal family just happened to be one of that small group. So the police did investigate. But then what is upsetting is that they investigated only in this very, very limited way. So it's the royal family. The police take off their helmets and doff them. So they come in and they do the job, but they present to the court a case which says, well, there are only 8 victims of this crime. In fact, they were sitting on evidence that there were 5,500. They ignore all the others. They present this case which is essentially about the royal family. And even then it's quite quirky and British, because they knew very well that the primary victims of this voicemail interception were Prince William, Prince Harry, Prince Charles, the royal family themselves. But you can't have a member of the royal family giving statements to the police or being called as a witness. Heaven forbid, how common. So they built the case around the staff, 3 of them who'd had their voicemails hacked. But it's so interesting because you've got this passive power of Murdoch, right? And it's the same with the royal family. I don't think the royal family or the household had to tell the police, don't call the Queen as a witness. It's just assumed she's too important to be treated like a normal person.
It's another kind of soft power there.
Exactly, passive power.
Right.
This society has not really moved on in that respect. Mind you, actually, that's probably a mistake. I would think power tends to operate like that across the world. Maybe a little bit more brazen here.
And what about the police? Was it financial, that incentive to have that relationship with the press, or again, were they in fear of the Rupert Murdoch, press machine?
Okay, there's 2 different levels.
Okay.
So I think when you get to the senior levels who are making decisions about who to investigate and who to back off, it's about the political fear that we've mentioned. At the lower levels, there were ordinary constables and the like who were earning small amounts of money by selling tips to newspapers. And that was illegal. And now there's something like, I think, a grand total of about 30 police officers, prison officers and civil servants who've been convicted. Most of them have ended up in prison now that that's been exposed. But they're 2 different things. It isn't the case that because newspapers were paying bribes to junior police officers, that's the reason why the investigation didn't take place. That's a political decision.
Did the police get off easy, in your opinion? Were they ever held accountable for what was going on?
So at the political level, they behaved really, really badly, because when we at The Guardian started dragging out the truth about all this, there was an assistant commissioner who was particularly aggressive in denouncing the newspaper and in denying the story. And he had access to all this detailed evidence which proved that what we were saying was true. And at the end of the day, he had to resign. So he lost his career. And he would probably have become the next commissioner. So that was quite a big, painful punishment that he suffered. And at the same time, the ultimate boss, the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, also resigned, kind of in the backwash of the scandal. So those 2 did become accountable. And at the lower level, as I've said, the junior officers who were taking bribes to some extent have been caught and convicted and often imprisoned. If you look at it institutionally, I was saying the story is about power, where power doesn't let other people unseat it at all easily. So we haven't changed very much. So if you look at the way that the Metropolitan Police react, the leadership of Scotland Yard spent many, many months concealing the truth and attacking the journalists and members of Parliament who were trying to bring it out. This was a cover-up at the most senior levels of the Metropolitan Police. We were able to get the story out in part because middle-ranking police officers who knew bits and pieces spoke to us. Good, brave whistleblowers. Okay. So the leadership of Scotland Yard sees this scandal blow up, that the boss man resigns, and so does the assistant commissioner, and they react in a cynical and authoritarian way. They take advantage of the shameful fact that junior officers had been taking bribes to say, okay, we now have to clamp down on the links between police officers and journalists. In future, Nobody's allowed to talk to a journalist unless we authorize it. So what this does is to silence the whistleblowers in the middle ranks, who are the guys who tried to tell the truth, and allow the upper ranks, who are the guys who were doing the cover-up, to decide what we in the public are told. So it was a complete inversion of what they should have done. They should have said, in order to stop the bribes being paid, and in order to stop the upper ranks engaging in this kind of cover-up again, we need to be far more transparent. Let officers talk to the public. There's some stuff out there which is secret. They mustn't tell secrets. But in principle, open the doors. That'll reduce the corruption. It'll reduce the cover-ups. So it was a disgraceful, cynical, authoritarian reaction by Scotland Yard. And they've got away with it because they're powerful.
Right, and that's power protecting itself. And
Yeah.
it always does that.
Exactly,
And
but
then
in a big way. So there was a phase there where they were enormously embarrassed. You know that expression about how the lights go on in the brothel and everybody's running around without their clothes on. It was kind of like that. Police, politicians, the lot. But really, unstoppably, it all falls back into place slowly over the next year or two. And when we published that book, Hack Attack, about all this, I caught a little bit of criticism from reviewers saying, oh, why is this guy so pessimistic? He says nothing has changed. But truly, I mean, I think we've probably stopped newspapers committing crimes, but if you look at the way that power operates, it's the opposite of change. They've got it still.
And the Murdoch empire, not a big change when it comes to their power.
No. So it's just been disclosed, in fact, that since the general election in this country, which was, about 7 months ago, Murdoch and his people have had 10 meetings, I think, with the Prime Minister or his people in Downing Street. How many meetings have you had? I mean, he hasn't invited me in either. So they've still got the access, and the access is the beginning of the influence. If you can get in there, because they're frightened of you, oh, please, Rupert, sit down. Will you have sugar with your tea? And what do you think about the European referendum? What do you think about wage rates and the minimum wage? He's got the chance to tell government what he wants, and against the background that they wish to placate him.
And you assert that Rupert Murdoch influenced Tony Blair on the decision about the EU and on a variety of foreign policy issues as well. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's quite amazing, actually. So you can look at very big issues. The two I highlighted quite briefly in the book were, one, if you look at Tony Blair's desire as Prime Minister to take Britain into the European currency, the euro, you can see that Rupert Murdoch has what I think you could argue is a decisive influence on that. So the Prime Minister may have wanted to take us into the euro. We didn't go there, rightly or wrongly, because of Murdoch's influence. A staggering scale of influence. I mean, Blair might argue with me, but I think that's a perfectly reasonable analysis. And I know certainly people in very senior political circles who agree with that. And then the other thing is the invasion of Iraq. I think that there what you would say is Murdoch has a really significant influence. It's substantial, but it's probably not quite decisive. Even if he hadn't existed, probably the pressure from Washington was enough to get us in there. But there is an enormous amount of contact going on between Murdoch and Blair and his cabinet. There are points, I think, where Murdoch's almost a sort of messenger from Washington, and he clearly wants that to happen. And that may be for ideological reasons, it may be for commercial reasons to do with the price of oil. That I can't explain. But he's in there pushing hard. And there was a moment I quoted in the book where he was somewhere and there was a bit of a press schmozzle around him. This is Rupert Murdoch. And a journalist said, do you think you influenced Blair's decision to go into Iraq? And he says something like, I don't know, we certainly tried. And there you begin to see it from the lion's mouth. So the funny thing is also, it extends across the spectrum, because I told in the book this story about how Rebecca Wade, as she then was, broke up with her partner, got divorced, and started a relationship with Charlie Brooks, to whom she eventually became married. And during that phase, when she was first going out with Charlie, Gordon Brown, who was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, understood that Rebecca's new boyfriend, Charlie, was a racehorse trainer. And he wanted to try and find some way to please Rebecca. And he knew that everybody in the horse racing world hates the specialist tax which they have to pay, which is called the horse race levy. So I heard from two different officials that our Chancellor of the Exchequer commissioned those officials to do a study to see whether they could repeal the horse race levy. Not because there was an enormous political pressure to do so, not because there was a financial and economic case for it, but because it would be a way of pleasing Rebecca's new boyfriend and therefore pleasing her. So it's kind of on this spectrum, from that kind of absurd genuflection and distortion of policy on a little thing, right the way through to the really big issues. We've got to keep Rupert and his people happy.
Walk me through this timeline, because I think each few years there are important events that kind of shape the whole piece and show what's actually happening. Because in 2007, I was here. I remember a little bit about the royal family, but it didn't hook in the public's mind. Did it not hook until 2011 when it was Millie Dowler involved? Or what was the kind of the timeline of big events there?
So January 2007, there's a rather small trial at the Old Bailey where you have the royal correspondent of the News of the World, Clive Goodman, and this specialist private investigator, Glenn Malcare. They plead guilty to intercepting the voicemail of these 8 people, and they get short prison sentences. So that's not a big story. It only lasts 48 hours. Everybody forgets about it. So that's January 07. January 08, I was contacted by somebody who said, there's an awful lot more to that story. And by that time, as a crucial element of the power background here, the guy who'd been editing the News of the World when all the crime was going on, Andy Coulson, had left and had gone to work for David Cameron, and who was already the leader of the Conservative Party, and it was clear that he was very likely to win the next general election. And then Andy Coulson would be in Downing Street, and his job would be to communicate, to liaise in the communication terms between the government and the people of this country. And if the source who was approaching me was right, then Andy Coulson was a liar. He was lying about the crime at the newspaper. And without wanting to sound too naive, the last person you want to be in charge of communication between government and people is a liar. Plus there was this other thought that if Coulson really had presided over a regime of that private investigator, Glenn Malcare, and others, intercepting people's communications, what would he do if he was in Downing Street and he thought, for example, that a cabinet minister was leaking information to a journalist? Would he call in a private investigator to intercept their communications? There was a very similar scandal in France under President Mitterrand. So for those 2 reasons, what this source was telling me about the scale of crime was immediately interesting and immediately took you into that world of power.
Did you not believe it at first? Did you think
no,
this was...
this was a credible source, but at the beginning, when he very first spoke to me, I didn't quite see the reason for bothering to get into the story. And then I saw the power connections. So January 07, there's the trial of the 2 guys. It doesn't amount to much. January 08, that source approaches me. I'm doing other stories, but I start working on it. The source is wonderful. And we roll it along in the wings. And it actually is something like 18 months before I've got enough information to publish a story. And that's quite a big one.
How does a source approach you? I'm just curious. Is it a deep throat, dark, parking structure, or is it just really simple?
He actually sent me an email and said, I need to talk to you. It's important. Here's my number. Call me and we'll arrange to meet, but don't leave a voicemail, which was kind of cute. And I didn't understand why at the time. And so then I met him, in fact, in a hotel room in London. A very well-informed, intelligent, likable person who stuck with me all the way through. So you have the trial of the 2 guys, January 07. That source approaches me, January 08. The first story is July 09. It's a big one. It says that Murdoch's people in the UK have just paid out more than £1 million to block legal actions which would have exposed the scale of the phone hacking. And so everybody starts running around shouting. We have the Assistant Commissioner from Scotland Yard coming out and saying the Guardian have got this wrong, the News of the World are okay. And then Rebecca Brooks, who's by now Murdoch's chief executive in the UK, she puts out a statement saying that we are deliberately misleading the British people. We're up against the wall. You then have a 2-year period where we're publishing story after story. I mean, in 60, 70, 100 stories, I don't know. And finally in July 09, they're beginning to wobble. By January 09, they're in trouble. They're on the retreat. Andy Coulson resigns in January 09 from his job in Downing Street.
Okay, Jan 09?
Oh, sorry, January 11. You're quite
11,
right.
Yeah,
You're
okay.
quite right. After
So
18 months of story.
And you're alone. The Guardian is alone in publishing.
Almost. There's 1 or 2 other reporters on the fringe. And there's MPs and lawyers who are joining in here. So, yeah, Coulson resigns in the January. The police set up a decent new inquiry in the January. But it doesn't really take off until we did the story about Millie Dowler, this schoolgirl who'd been abducted and murdered, that the News of the World had been inside her voicemail. That was in July 2011. If we'd done that story on its own, it wouldn't have had big breakthrough impact, but the dam was straining and almost ready to burst, and that story did it.
And that got the public's attention because they had information in that voicemail that potentially could have saved her life, and the public was outraged? No, it's simpler than that. It's an emotional reaction that the
the face of that 12-year-old schoolgirl is enormously familiar to people in this country. When she went missing, her photograph was everywhere. Home video of her was all over the television as the police tried to find her. And then eventually she's found, murdered, and a horrible, horrible man went to jail for it. There's an enormous amount of sympathy and care for that little girl built in. And all we're saying, essentially, is something disgusting. That while she was missing, before the body was found, at a time when her family, her mother, father, friends, are calling her, saying, Millie, Millie, please get in touch. There are journalists with beer on their breath and breakfast egg on their tie listening to all that. And it's too much. Just back off. There are some things you can't do, even if the police aren't watching you. There are just some things you know you can't do, and that's one of them. And what happened was that there was this chain reaction that, coming after 2 years of exposure, that story was strong enough that it forced the other newspapers who'd been refusing to cover the story for various reasons to get involved. And there was this extraordinary sequence of events where the day after we'd done the Millie Dowler story, the Daily Telegraph disclosed that the families of some of the people who'd been killed in terrorist bombs in the London Underground system in July 2005, those families had had their voicemails hacked. And you're hitting that, what? It's that button. How could you do it? And then the next day, the Telegraph disclosed that the families of British soldiers killed in Afghanistan had also had their voicemail hacked. And that sequence is just so powerful that you've got a sort of tsunami of revulsion spreading across the country. And in the commercial world, people start saying, we're not going to advertise in your newspaper anymore. And in the political world, all those politicians who were frightened of Murdoch and placating him, all, so to speak, cross the floor and start to speak out. It just becomes impossible to support him.
For someone who's been covering that for 18 months, I mean, does that finally feel like, thank God that we finally have some momentum here so everyone can know what you've known for 18 months? I just wonder what it's like to hold on to that story for that long. Is it frustrating? Is it liberating? Is it gratifying?
Okay, so I think if you took the first 6 months after we published that first story, we're under attack from the police, from the Murdoch company. Then the Press Complaints Commission published a report saying we were wrong. And it's an anxious time. I told in the book about how during that period I got into a taxi in London. The driver says, what do you do? Oh, I'm a reporter. What sort of work do you do? And when I told him that I'd been working on the phone hacking stories, he went, oh yeah, that all turned out to be wrong, didn't it? And you think, oh shit, this is not great. So you're being made to look like an idiot and a liar, and your newspaper is suffering. So that was worrying, but very slowly we began to turn it around. And I think that, as I said, by the time we got round to publishing the Millie Dowler story, we'd already crossed the vindication line where it was clear that what we were saying was true. And Andy Coulson resigned, the new police inquiry is set up. I think once the Millie Dowler story has been published, what happens is it's just like an adrenaline overload. So I'm sitting at home trying to write follow-up stories, and the phone never stops ringing because other journalists want information and television interviews and radio interviews, and there are reactions happening. 4 or 5 days later, the News of the World closed. It's like, what the hell did that happen? Whoa. So you're running on adrenaline, you're sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night. It's that really, it's just overwhelming what happens. And that lasted for 2 or 3 weeks, including that Rupert Murdoch and James Murdoch appearing in front of the Select Committee, which you remember.
Right, and that is a journalist's crowning achievement. That's what everyone puts in all the years, to have a moment like that where everything's relevant, the work you put in is now being listened to, and you can see the potential to really change the power structure. Were you optimistic then, or did you really wonder if there was anything that was going to change?
Well, I think the honest answer is that it was all moving too fast for me to step back and think, I wonder what's going to happen here. But I think once things calmed down, I did think that we would get a decent way of regulating the press so that the bad newspapers, well, and the good, would have to abide by the code of conduct which they themselves have written. I thought we'd get that much out of it, but we didn't. But I didn't have any illusions about changing the ability of a media mogul to go and bully government. That was never within our reach because of what we've said about the way that power holds on.
Those few weeks happened of adrenaline. What are kind of those next big steps?
Well, then once, you see, the weird thing about being a reporter or maybe writing non-fiction books is that you can dump lots and lots of information into the public domain, but what you can't do is to predict or control what then happens. So once you've hit the Millie Dowler moment, events then take over. I almost become a spectator on my own story. I think I do become a spectator. So there are 2 more police inquiries that are set up, one into email hacking and sundry other crimes, one into bribery and corruption, as well as the other new inquiry into voicemail hacking. So there's masses of police activity. Then, in the midst of the furore after Millie Dowler, David Cameron announces the Leveson inquiry. And that was, I thought, extraordinary. And if there's, I thought that was a great inquiry. And to the extent that I had anything to do with the chain reaction which led to it, I was glad. Because power naturally enjoys being secretive. If you have power, you have the ability to make things secret. If you can make things secret, you can exercise power more easily. It's a perfect marriage.
Can you explain the Leveson inquiry for people that
sure.
don't know? Yeah, sure.
So the Prime Minister appointed this High Court judge, Lord Justice Leveson, who was given a great deal of power to summon witnesses to appear in front of him and to order the production of documents, text messages, email messages, in order to uncover the culture and practice of the press. It wasn't about voicemail hacking, it's about what the hell have these newspapers been doing. And the result of that was that day after day, week after week, live, online, we had 4 prime ministers compelled to come and sit in front of a microphone and explain what had really been going on in their offices in relation to the press and the media barons. But not just the 4 prime ministers, cabinet ministers, senior civil servants, police officers, chief constables, reporters, the most secretive animals of all, newspaper editors. They all had to come and sit in front of that microphone and explain in detail what had been going on in the corridors of power. And on occasion that included having text messages and emails disclosed. So that was really exciting. Why shouldn't we know what's going on in the corridors of power? Okay, you've got to keep some nuclear stuff secret and some financial stuff secret, but you guys keep much too much secret. And this was, I would say, a unique chance to see the mechanics of power exposed. That was great. And there was some nitty-gritty in there about what had been going on behind the scenes, more or less at the same time as we did the Millie Dowler story, when Murdoch's people in the UK were trying to buy the big chunk that they didn't already own of the satellite broadcaster, B-Sky B, which is an enormously lucrative, big, fat cash cow. And they wanted it very badly. And what you could see in the Leveson inquiry was that quite improperly, the government minister who was having to make the decision about whether there was a monopoly problem, a competition problem around that purchase, had secretly opened a back channel to the Murdoch people. And there was all sorts of information flowing backwards and forwards through that back channel. And that's completely against the rules. This minister was operating in what they call a quasi-judicial role, i.e. as though he were a judge. And his officials had made it clear you can't have any contact with the Murdoch people while you're making this decision. So the exposure of that back channel was really rather thrilling, because I hadn't been able to expose that as a reporter. But Lord Justice Leveson had the power to pull that out. I mean, that's just one example. You had week after week after week.
And that was in 2013, was Leveson?
No, I would say winter of 2012,
okay.
I think.
And the News of the World had closed by then?
The News of the World closed extremely rapidly. Okay. So we published the Millie Dowler story, I think, on a Monday. By Thursday, they were announcing the paper was closed, and that Sunday was its last edition. So that's July 2011.
Okay. How did it make you feel when they had to close down? I'm sure
pretty sick.
Because you had colleagues there, because that's a fellow...
Yeah, so nobody in The Guardian or in the political world, to the extent that it was reacting to these stories, was asking for the News of the World to be closed. And I don't know, I think the newspaper was employing about 200 people at that time, of whom perhaps a dozen were involved in crimes. So it was disgusting to throw more than 180 people out of work when they were innocent. And the reason that that was done was primarily, we now know, because of the political problems they were running into with the B-Sky B bid. As I said, this story had built up to the point where it was causing them lots of trouble, and it had begun to cause political difficulty for the bid. So they thought, it's clear, this is from internal email, which has since been disclosed, if we shut the paper, we can kind of wash our hands of it and say we now have clean hands, so let us go ahead with this big purchase.
Sacrifice the paper and we might be able to get the B-Sky B buyout.
Exactly, and that was pretty cynical.
Right, which didn't work, obviously.
No,
But at the time, that was a big bet for Murdoch to make, because he had to shut that paper down. It was...
Yeah. But I mean, these are selfish, ruthless people. I don't think they worried too much about the people. I mean, that may be unfair, but it doesn't seem to me they worried very much about the people whose jobs were being lost. Some of them were subsequently re-employed because they then relaunched a different Sunday newspaper a year or so later.
Did journalists react to you when that happened? Did you get heat? Did you get blame? Were you a hated man?
Well, so it divides into two chunks, really. I think an enormous number of journalists, including as many as 30 different people who'd worked for the News of the World, wanted all this crime and corruption exposed, because most journalists do not think that we should be committing crimes. They don't think we should be invading people's privacy. They don't think we should be bullying government. They know what's right and what's wrong. There is a small number of journalists who are addicted to that kind of world of tabloid crime and tabloid bullying. And they certainly hate me, hate Alan Rusbridger, who was the editor of The Guardian, hate Tom Watson, the most outspoken politician on it. And you know, what can you do about them? So they would be those sort of people would say, it was The Guardian that closed the News of the World. Well, it really wasn't. It was their boss, Rupert Murdoch. But, you know, Tennyson has that great line, I'd be a fool to reason with a fool. And I'm not interested in engaging in debate with the bad guys in Fleet Street. They have spent years bringing shame on the profession of all of us. Most journalists are decent, honest people who really want to tell the truth about the world to people, and they may fail, but that's what they're trying to do. And there's just this small minority of bullies and bad guys who've got themselves into powerful positions on some newspapers, and they are remorseless, merciless, and unreformed.
From the Levinson Commission, did you ever see Murdoch having to testify?
Yes, so Murdoch popped up twice, once at the Select Committee, about 2 weeks after we'd done the Millie Dowler story in July 2011, and again at Leveson, where he gave evidence on oath. When he was in front of the Select Committee, there was some quite good questioning, but those committees are famous for not being particularly good at interrogating people, because these are politicians. At Leveson, he was up against this very clever and articulate barrister called Robert Jay, who's now become a High Court judge, and he was sweating, he was in trouble. I think that Robert Jay would agree that at the end of the day, he didn't finally break him, but he had him up against the wall.
I remember watching that, and it felt like he was really trying, but sometimes it felt like he wasn't going for the knockout blow. That's just the only recollection I have.
Of Robert Jay?
Yeah, but maybe it's because Rupert was kind of playing this, kind of this senility play, or kind of this...
Well, there's that, but also the nature of a public inquiry is slightly odd, that, because I gave evidence there twice, that Robert Jay can push you pretty hard, but he hasn't got the freedom of movement that he would if he was in cross-examining in a criminal court.
Yeah.
He's got to be a little bit courteous. He's acting for the inquiry. He's not acting for the opposition. So there's a slight compromise on the extent of the aggression that he's allowed to deploy. But he definitely had Murdoch in trouble. I can't remember all the details, to tell you the truth, but I can remember writing about it. And do you listen to Bob Dylan?
Yes, sometimes.
You know, he had, ages ago, mid-60s, he had this song about even the President of the United States still sometimes must have to stand naked. And later when he sang it after the Watergate scandal, everybody cheered. But I used that at the end of the story. Even the president of News Corp sometimes may have to stand naked.
What was it like being in the room with him and watching him testify? Did he make eye contact with you?
No. So I was sitting there in this select committee room when he and James Murdoch came in. And the first thing that struck me was how ordinary he is. He's little, with a little crumpled suit and a little bald head and little glasses. And where you think, you know, he's a big guy because he's a media mogul, because he's rich, because he's got power. But physically, he was rather small and unimpressive. And then, as you've mentioned, he was sitting there doing this I can't quite remember who I am thing, which I am convinced was a stunt. I've ended up talking to quite a lot of people who've worked with him, and they say he's notorious for being scary. If you are his lawyer or his PR person, and you're trying to brief him for a press conference or an appearance in front of a US Senate committee, you're worried because this guy's going to go maverick on you. He's not going to stick to the script. So he's not as gaga as he was coming across as, and I think they told him, if you find yourself in a corner and you're worried that you might say something that blow it, just go gaga for a moment. And he was drumming his fingers. I can't really remember what I said to Tony Blair. No, sorry, can't remember. So there was a lot of that. Okay, So on the whole...
Do you think that could have gone the other way? Do you think if he had been in a weird mood, in the mood he's in sometimes when he tweets, that he might have said, hold on a second, blah, blah, blah.
Yes, it's exactly. The tweets where he blows it are exactly examples of what those advisors are talking about, that he suddenly goes maverick and says terrible things.
Can you imagine if that would have happened at the inquiry? Would things...
It would have been stunning. But I mean, they spent days and days with him rehearsing before the select committee and the inquiry. You know, and there's somebody pretending to be the inquisitor asking questions, how are you going to deal with this, how are you going to deal with that? And if you forget the answer, go gaga. So what I'm trying, you asked me what it was like sitting there. It was curiously unimpressive. And then it was really annoying that you remember at the select committee, there was this idiot who stood up and walked down the side in front of me, over towards Murdoch, who's sitting a few chairs in front of me, and tried to slap him in the face with a plate full of shaving foam or something. And in the moment when he did that, I could see him walking towards Murdoch because he had to come in front of me to get to him. And I, in spite of all the efforts I'd made to expose what Murdoch's people were up to, blurted out a warning instinctively. And that then becomes important because this is an old man. He was 80 or 81, I think, at that time. This is a young guy slapping something into his face, and it isn't fair. It doesn't matter if you're angry with Murdoch. You don't do that. And it was a disaster. This guy with the shaving foam was an idiot and an egomaniac. And the result was, first of all, it stopped the inquiry. There was some quite good questioning that was building up pressure on him. All that pressure was lost. And then beyond that, rightly, public sympathy went his way towards the old man who's just been assaulted. Plus, the tabloid newspapers who were going to have to report this session then had a lovely story to report which didn't involve their admitting any of the facts that were being exposed, because they did the story about how Murdoch's then wife jumped up and kind of attacked the attacker.
Did that scare you when Wendy took a swing at him?
No, it's all happening too quickly. That lasted like a total of 2 seconds. You're, what the... No, but it was really stupid.
Okay, and it took away attention and it gave them an excuse not
Reduced
to go.
the pressure, everything.
Okay.
And we were all chucked out of the room. We weren't even, but when it resumed, we were in the next room watching on a screen, so you couldn't even see the man giving his evidence. But there we are. Anyway, before that, it was really interesting. And James Murdoch got himself into a terrible twist in the detail of what he hadn't done.
And so ultimately, they couldn't purchase B Sky B. James was all teed up to kind of take that and ride it off and really be the successor with that deal to Rupert.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. He didn't come away looking great, not horrible, but it didn't kill his career. What was the aftermath of it? How do you look back on what happened there or the 6 months afterwards?
Well, hang on, there's 2 different chapters here, because first of all, you know George Clooney's trying to direct a film about this.
I just heard that today.
Okay, so one of the reasons for that is you've got a wonderful narrative. I sometimes say it's a bit like the Hobbits. These little guys, so there's the little reporter and the little lawyers and the little MPs, and we're going to go for the big dragon, and there's no way we're going to win, but holy moly, we do. And in that month we're talking about, when there's a sort of a temporary victory, there is this extraordinary coincidence that we've been muddling along here trying to expose the phone hacking scandal. In the background, Murdoch's trying to buy B Sky B, and understand this was the biggest cash deal on the planet that year. This was the biggest deal he'd ever tried to pull off in his entire career. And understand if he'd got it, the point was to have this enormous amount of cash flowing his way each year so that he could borrow even more money and take over either Time Warner or Disney and finally become the biggest media company in the world. This was a big, big thing. And this little hacking story that's an irritation on the side is suddenly coming together at exactly the same time. So the government, with their back channel from the minister, has finally got to the point of saying, okay, let's give him the green light. Let's let him have B Sky B. And they say, well, 1 more week for a bit more public reaction, and then we'll give you the green light. And in that week, the Millie Dowler story came out. And that's what makes it such an extraordinary story, the coincidence.
To watch the rest of this fascinating interview, click on the link below and go to londonrealacademy.com. There you can sign in with your social media login and watch the rest of the episode for free, along with all of our episodes on London Real, my webinars, and all of our premium content, all located over at londonrealacademy.com. So click on the link below, you'll be directed there, and you can watch the rest of this fascinating interview, and I'll see you there.
James Murdoch, who endured a great deal of criticism, in fact.